Happy Sabbath, everyone. I pray that you've had a good week. Seeing as we've already prayed, we'll just get straight into today's study. Um, so, the idea is that I'll continue from where I left off last week and continue on in the same format, same theme. So, please feel free to participate again. I'll try and keep the participation a bit shorter just so we can get through as much of the material as possible. But that's not me discouraging you from participating. Um, so last week we were looking at a piece of history in our reform line, specifically the time period between uh, oops, specifically the time period between Panium and the Sunday Law, because it's my belief that if we are to understand the Sunday Law waymark, we have to understand the story that was being told in the lead up to that waymark. And so there were four key themes that we started fleshing out, we started unpacking, and each of these topics can be expanded on further. It's just because of time constraints and the opportunity, I've had to condense each of the topics into one study. But the first thing that we looked at was this time period in between Panem and the Sunday Law, and it's described in the story of Acts 27 on the ship of Adramyttium as when the leadership of the ship is changing. Um, and it's Paul takes charge of that ship where the Romans were leading it before. And in application, we recognize that the leadership of God's church is changing from the Adventist church to us. It's a process that had started from 1989, but in in its fullest sense, now we see it taking place, and it's the fall of that leadership as well. And in the same breath, we have the rise of the seventh kingdom and the fall of the sixth kingdom in its relationship to the USA. And so often when we talk about this rise of the seventh kingdom, we solely mark it as the fall of the sixth and the fall of the seventh. But when we talk about the rise of the leadership of God's church, we recognize that there's a change of leadership from the Adventist institution and how it's currently set up to us. But I think if we juxtapose these two entities, the USA and God's church, the respective kings of the North, we can learn something from that juxtaposition. We know a lot more about what it means for us to take leadership of this church. So that's on the one hand, and we can use that information that we know from that to explain this change of leadership in the USA or up until you get to the seventh kingdom of Bible prophecy. So in this change of leadership, we recognize that while we may not hold the seat or the office of leadership in the Adventist church as it exists today, in God's eyes, even though we can't see it here on earth, we are the true leaders of God's church. And so when we look at Satan's kingdom, we can expect to see similar things transpiring. So in the story of Daniel 2, when we're here in Daniel 2, and we talk about the statue that's been created, we track the sequence of these kingdoms from Babylon to Medo-Persia to Greece to Rome, but they're all the king of the north. It's the same kingdom. It's the same statue from head to toe. All that's happening when we have those switches is Satan recognizing that I need a new leader for my kingdom to accomplish a specific work. And that's what God does. Through the various phases of God's church, there's time periods or dispensations where God is going to do a work. And so God is going to raise up a new set of leaders to accomplish the work that God feels is necessary to accomplish. And that's what Satan is doing. So when you get to the fall of the sixth kingdom and the rise of the seventh kingdom, what is happening is Satan is saying, I need a new leader. I need new leaders to take hold of my kingdom to accomplish the work that I want to accomplish, whatever that work is, or whatever that work will be. So if we look at Panium and we ask the question, but who is the seventh kingdom? We don't see them in office. I think understanding how it looks for us with regards to leadership of God's church, the Adventist church, can give us some clues to how it could look with regards to Satan's kingdom and leadership there. The second thing that we wanted to explore was this idea of shipwreck. And if we want to understand, sorry, my screen just stopped sharing. Could you give me a moment? My internet's just stopped working. Please let me know when you can see my screen again.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. So we started speaking about this shipwreck, and one of the things that we discussed was in order to understand what shipwreck looks like, we need to understand what the purpose of that ship was from the beginning. And so we tracked its journey, when it goes off course and why. There were principles established at its founding that it was meant to grow in its development of as a good ship, protector of God's people. But then when you get to 1863, there's a consensus that we need to define America in a specific way because we need God to protect it and we need to recognize God in this nation. And so in God we trust gets birthed as they try to search for a new motto. And then Abraham Lincoln gives his Gettysburg Address and describes it as a godly nation, one nation under God. And so as I was thinking about this through the week, another line of history came to mind where we can see this culmination of an ideology bringing you to a specific point. And that's the line of Christ, or the line of the disciples, however you want to call it. I've listed out specific waymarks in that, and I've stopped it at 34 AD because that's what I'm interested in. I haven't gone past that waymark. So this line that I have drawn out here is a combination of, in that history, the line of what we would call the priests, as well as the longer line, what we would call the 144,000. But I've taken the key waymarks from those two lines, if that makes sense. But I'm going to describe this development as an ideology that was embedded in the Pharisees' worldview that led them to the point of 34 AD. And we see this story unfolding through these various waymarks. In 4 BC, when Jesus is born, you have the angels that fly past Jerusalem because they see that the church's leadership isn't prepared to do God's work. And then you get to the baptism of Jesus, and the Holy Spirit descends on Jesus, and John points out to the Pharisees that you're a brood of vipers, and he calls them out and points out that they're unworthy to to be the custodians of God's church. And so God is going to raise up a different group of people to do that work. And so, yeah, that's the Pharisees rejecting Jesus at his baptism, and John calls them out for it. And then the next major waymark we have in the development of that story is the first temple cleansing, which we line up with 2014. And that's when Jesus goes into the temple, and there's this direct challenge from the Pharisees, or direct challenge to the Pharisees' authority by Jesus, where Jesus exposes their hypocrisy. Because the Pharisees see the temple as the center of religious power, where their power resides. And Jesus emphasizes, this is my house. This is not your house. Your ideology has turned this temple into something that it's not what it was built up to be. And then the next waymark is the cross. And by this point, the Pharisees' ideology had come to a point where it's in complete rebellion against God's purposes. And I just want to remind us that it's at the cross that we line up with 2019. As last week we were talking about how the message of shipwreck comes at 2019 at midnight, where Paul is told by the angel, shipwreck is coming. And it's at this point where you have the workings of the cross, the Pharisees crucifying Jesus. They view Jesus as a blasphemer, etc., etc. And then the next waymark is Pentecost. And they're so gone in their mindset that they look at the disciples and all that are receiving the Holy Spirit at Pentecost as crazy people. And they do their utmost best to suppress this growing Christian movement. They're resistant to the gospel. They're not benefited by the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And then you get to the stoning of Stephen, which is this culmination of all these events that brought the Pharisees' ideology to a point where they're actively going to kill God's messengers, as they resist the Holy Spirit, and now they're in outright violence against God's messengers. So I'm placing Pentecost. I've taken these from Elder Tessa's study on the line of Christ, where Pentecost is placed in 2021, because that's when the harvest of the Levites takes place, between 2021 and the Sunday Law.
On Christ's line, I meant, Curtis.
I don't understand. What exactly is the question?
Were you placing Pentecost on the Christ's line?
When you say where am I placing it, I'm placing Pentecost as an event, as a waymark.
Yeah, I know that, but there's a place we put it on the Christ line. I'm just wondering, because if
Could you
you line
elaborate?
up,
I don't fully understand.
when I see where you place Pentecost on the line of Christ, then we can see the tallies up with the 144,000. But I know you're doing the priest line. I just want to know.
I'm combining those lines. As I said at the beginning, I'm just taking all the waymarks that lead up to the stoning of Stephen. So I'm not drawing out a priest line or 144,000 line. I'm just taking waymarks in that story.
You put Pentecost at 2021 for the priest. I agree, but I'd like to
Pentecost is a waymark in that story as a whole. So it's in my mind, you don't place Pentecost on the line of the priests and on the line of the 144,000 at two separate places. It's just a tracking of that story. So there's only one place that you can place Pentecost. So if you're going to make different applications.
My question is, where is it placed? Where does Elder Tess place it on the line of
At
Christ?
2021.
On the line of Christ.
When Pentecost happens. I don't know, are you looking for a year when Pentecost happens? It's after Jesus is crucified. I don't know what year it is. It's probably in 31 AD. Yeah.
It's 50 days after the cross, yeah.
Yeah.
Like the upper room.
Yeah, after the upper room experience.
Thank you.
Okay. So we get to this culmination, this point where now the Pharisees' ideology is so cemented in its place that persecution is going to take place going forward. But what I want to take away from that is that it is this buildup of the Pharisees digging into an ideology that had been festering for years, and it brings you to its pinnacle at 34 AD. There's, in describing Satan at least, in Desire of Ages, page 761, Ellen White says the following. I'll just paraphrase it. So that's DA, page 761. So this is after the crucifixion. Ellen White is describing the events or the great controversy. And she says, Satan saw that his disguise was torn away. His admiration was laid open before the unfallen angels and before the heavenly universe. And he had revealed himself as a murderer. This is paragraph 2, by the way, 761 paragraph 2. And when Jesus shed his blood, he had uprooted himself from the sympathies of heavenly beings. Henceforth, his work was restricted. Whatever attitude he might assume, he could no longer await the angels as they came from the heavenly courts, and before them accused Christ's brethren of being clothed with the garments of blackness and the defilement of sin. The last link of sympathy between Satan and the heavenly world was broken. So this cross, which we line up with 2019, was a decisive moment in said great controversy between Jesus and Satan. In particular, Ellen White is noting the fact that the cross, Satan's fate was sealed and his true character was revealed to the universe. And all intelligent beings in the universe saw that God's ways were just and righteous. And so I'm taking that story and applying it to the Pharisees, because the Pharisees are just proxies of Satan. They're tools of Satan in this great controversy battle. And so, again, in 2019, we have, externally at least, there's this ideology that is cementing the fact that the ship is going to be shipwrecked. So from this point on, the Jewish church couldn't go back. Well, from waymarks before, they couldn't go back, but now it's laid bare, it's laid open. And then you get to the stoning of Stephen, which was the climax of this ideological trajectory. I'm emphasizing this point over and over again because it's really the theme of my study, that this is a story of an ideology that sees its fruit at a specific waymark. And so when we discussed that shipwreck, which in the line of Christ and Jesus happens at 34 AD for us at the Sunday law, we went on to Pyrrhus, the story of this ambassadorial exchange and Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges. And I suggested that this is reflective of a threefold union that's starting to be established from 273 AD. And if we want to understand that symbol of Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges and everything that that symbol entails, i.e. the voting or the flood or anything related to that symbol, we need to understand his role in the context of the story that's been told in the history of Pyrrhus. So voting, when we take Fabius and Faber beans and etc., needs to be understood in that context. And I think that's the important point when we get to it, is that let's take that story and understand its context so we can understand what voting is in that context. In 273, Egypt initiates that alliance, that threefold union, that's ratified at 275. Ratified at the next waymark. Can't remember the date. 272. Yeah, 272. Hello? Okay. Yeah, that's ratified at the next waymark. And in that history, we have Egypt, Rome, and Pyrrhus, the king of the north, the king of the south, and the dragon. and we recognized that Egypt represents the dragon. So this is the union of ideologies, as this is describing said threefold union. So the last thing we ended off on was, let's talk about this ideology of the dragon. Ellen White will tell you, as we read in our quote, that the dragon, the civil element, has a civil element and a religious, as Charity had explained, element. There's two sides to this coin, but I framed it as an ideology. The King of the North, or no, not the King of the North, Protestantism does too. And Catholicism. So Ellen White will tell you that the ideology associated with the dragon is spiritualism. That's what Ellen White says, E.G. White. When Elder Tess went through her studies in the Vespers and in succeeding months and studies by different teachers, what did we understand to be reflective of the dragon? So Ellen White will say spiritualism, and I'm just going to put Elder Tess because she did the primary studies on the topic. Calls it what? If anyone can remember. If no one can remember, that's not a good look.
You want about atheism?
Yeah. So Tess is going to say it's atheism. That's the ideology or the worldview that is directing the movements of the dragon. There's another term that we associate with atheism. They're unrelated, but they're connected with regards to how you organize a society. So there's a worldview that we've discussed over and over and over again with regards to the underlying ethos of conservatism, or at least today's manifestation of conservatism. It's built on this ethos. Say?
Libertarian? No.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah. Libertarianism. So what is libertarianism, Emma? I think that was you that answered.
It basically centers
Because-
around freedom of speech, freedom of action. I think everybody, yeah, freedom.
Okay,
Very
but we
freedom.
recognize that there's freedom in really all ideologies. Freedom exists. So
I
what
suppose freedom
exactly
over
about freedom?
equality.
Okay, so
The mind of
explain more. Freedom over equality. What does that mean in practice?
So when it comes to people, freedom of speech, for instance, they can pretty much say what they like, even if it hurts. Well, actually, no, they don't say that. They do say if it hurts someone else, you can't, but it's what your definition of hurting someone else is. It's a bit vague. So when it comes to equal rights, they favor what we would say was the perpetrator over the victim. To give an example.
Yeah.
That's someone else.
Yeah. Someone else want to chip in? It's along the lines of what Emma's describing.
I'd like to add something.
Yeah, go for it.
Libertarianism postulates minimal government regulation.
Okay, so there's this idea of freedom and it's connected. So now we're going into how a government is organized. So you're going to have a central government. Please repeat that in your words. You're going to have a central government, and then what is the relationship with everything else in that society to the central government?
Okay. The way
It's what you said.
Yeah. the government is not involved as much in people's affairs. So kind of
So
threw me off balance there, but yeah, that's
minimal intervention.
yeah, and regulation.
Regulation. So if we think about individuals and we want to think about individuals coming to certain conclusions or behaving in a certain way, as Emma described, there's an emphasis on freedom because there's this recognition that in coming out of a monarchy, in coming out of the Dark Ages, in coming out of world as the world knew it before 1798, there was a very top-down, heavy system of government where there was a lack of freedom with regards to thought, a lack of freedom with regards to desires, a lack of freedom with regards to the pursuit of happiness. There was this lack of freedom. And so libertarians will see the world as the opposite. So instead of having these regulations or these interventions that are coming from the central governing body, let's set up a system where individuals have the freedom to pursue their dreams without said regulation. So if we were to think of the economy, for instance, an example would be companies or banks should let capitalism run wild. Let capitalism do its work without the government coming in and creating safety nets. Because eventually you'll have a trickle-down economy, i.e., the big corporations who have lots of money, who make lots of money because they're providing services, will trickle down all that wealth generation to everyone else. So they don't see the world as wanting to go out and oppress people. The world view is that people can be lifted up if given the freedom to pursue happiness on their own without any helping hand, without anyone creating guardrails to do that. So as Elder Tess described it, it sounds like a very noble ethos. But as we go through example after example, you can see how it's a double-edged sword. That on one hand, it's beautiful because freedom is a God-given right. We have the freedom to pursue happiness, liberty, but in the same breath, the other edge of that sword, albeit for a lot, unintended consequences are that someone is going to get hurt. So if we can understand or park that idea, remember that's the ethos that's driving the dragon. It's not separate to spiritualism because underneath it all, spiritualism was, if I can put it simply, I can have a relationship with God without a governing body. I don't need the church to be involved in my relationship with God. I don't need a movement. I don't need religion to be involved in my relationship with God. I can do it on my own. And often we hear that when people say, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. It's when we take spiritualism from the Bible, it was Saul going to the witch of Endor on his own when he had a designated route of how to approach God, which was through the church, or the church at that time. But he goes about it in his own way because he wants to have that spiritual relationship on his own. He doesn't need that central governing body. And so he calls up the dead and etc. So in that way, we can see how spiritualism, libertarianism are the same thing. They're just manifestations of the same underlying principle, as has been written in the chat, freedom without control. So if you're able to speak, I'd prefer if you speak. If you're not, then that's okay. I'll read out your chats. So Primrose has written in the chat, a libertarian is committed to the principle that liberty is the most important political value And then Charity said that there's also this idea that without government, regulation, or intervention in people's life, even if society or people are racist or sexist or homophobic, they'll eventually see the bad in it and change for themselves. So yeah, it's this belief that we would get to a utopia without outside intervention. We could just do it on our own through debating ideas, through argument, through recognition of what's good and bad, and eventually society would converge at a place where it's at a good place. So that's and then as Primrose wrote in the last message, it's freedom without control. So that's the underlying ethos of the dragon, whether you want to call it spiritualism or libertarianism. And then, as Richard pointed out, atheism, it's all the same thing, because atheism is, I don't believe in a central governing body, i.e. a deity in my life. I can achieve all that is good on my own. I can arrive to being a better person on my own. I can arrive to society doesn't need this oversight from a being outside of Earth to converge at being a good society. So if you're going to call it spiritualism, if you're going to call it atheism or libertarianism, it's all the same underlying ethos or way of viewing the world and humanity's relationship between each other as well as the state. So you can look at it from a just how individuals interact with each other level, or, which is what we're going to do, look at it from a political level, from how nations are set up, specifically the USA, and this belief of how the USA should be set up. So before we get to that point, let's think about this while committed to exploring this time period between 2021 and the Sunday Law, this change of leadership. Remember that embedded in between this period is this 273 and this alliance between the dragon, Egypt, and the king of the north, Rome. And it's an ideological alliance, i.e. they have different agendas, but at their base, they arrive at the same conclusion. So we should see something that, as we've discussed, has a libertarian mindset from the Egypt that brings you to the same conclusion as the king of the north. So you're going to associate that with the papacy or with apostate Protestantism. There's that same underlying belief in patriarchy. So how do three different entities with three different agendas get to that same point as the dragon is rising? This is a story of the dragon, really. And we can see that in the development of a message, that Boston, Concord, Exeter, shut door model that we explored. From 2021 up until the Sunday Law, Anium, up until the Sunday Law, we have, as with past dispensations, we have the arrival of a message and the development of that message. In these lines, at the top here, in these lines, 2021, no, apologies, internet is not great. Does what we've gone through make sense while I try to sort out this
Can I
internet? Yeah.
I was
Yeah.
just wondering, you're talking about the 273, and I can't remember what you said about relations or ideology. That's it. We know that it's a diplomatic relationship, 273. And we know Elder Tess, I think she put geopolitical diplomatic relationship 273. How would you explain that when we look at ideology?
I'm
'Cause
taking,
and diplomatic and geopolitical.
so when I look at how states in the world operate,
Who in
they
the world?
may not, Hello? States,
Sorry.
like nation states.
Okay, yeah.
Often we try to seek alliances as signed deals, as let's go into a partnership to go and take down this other nation. But when Elder Tess and Elder Paminda have described the threefold union and tried to make sense of what that threefold union looks like, often we try to reflect how those nation states in the world form their alliances, their partnerships through treaties, through like NATO alliances or EU alliances, and etc. We try to reflect that model onto this model of the threefold union. And it doesn't work because they have different agendas. They don't see eye to eye, i.e., they're not friends. So the example that Elder Tess gave was from 1989, you have this story of the Catholic Church and you have the USA, but it's not a story of them being friends, and it's not a story of them ever being friends. Instead, you get to the Sunday law and you have the image of the beast paying homage to the papacy. And they do it in spite of themselves, as Ellen White will say. They do it without the intention of doing so. Because as we look at the 1890s history, when they wanted to enshrine a Sunday law into the constitution or create a Sunday law, the Catholic Church pointed to the Protestant Church and said, do you not see how you're stabbing yourselves in the foot? Because you say you're protesting us, but in reality, you're just honoring us because this is an institution that we created. So I don't believe that this threefold union, again, just reflecting Elder Tessa's sentiments, that this threefold union is them coming into active partnership to achieve something. Instead, it's a reflection of ideologies that meet up.
They're all patriarchal and sexist.
Yeah,
Okay,
essentially.
when we look at okay, thank you, Curtis. When we look at the 273 waymark BC, isn't it about the king of the south and the king of the north?
It's about the king of the north and Egypt. It's not about the king of the south.
Okay,
Yeah, so that's why we went through that process of identifying who the players were. Pyrrhus is the king of the south in that story. Egypt is this other entity. It's this world, the representative of the world, or the dragon, as we would
why are
call
we
it.
not talking about Pyrrhus and the king of the south?
Because when those ambassadors were changed, Pyrrhus wasn't part of that exchange. It was
Okay.
part of that wider story because the Rome had defeated Pyrrhus and now there's recognition of Rome. So the exchange of ambassadors is going to be between Rome and Egypt, not between Pyrrhus because Pyrrhus is defeated.
Okay, I just wanted to say that although you're saying ideology, that's what the 273 is. They're coming together. Elder Terry recently said it was NATO.
Well,
I'm just saying.
I'm doing my study.
Yeah.
The key point is that they are not friends. The papacy and Protestant America are not friends. The UN, or if you want to call it the dragon, is not friends with the Catholic Church. But from different avenues, they arrive at the same conclusion. But going back to this development of a message that arrives at a specific waymark. In these lines, 2021 on the line of the 144,000 is, as we understand it, is the formalization. So we have a message arrive unsealed in 2001, and we have the increase of knowledge, and we have the formalization, and then we have the shut door where the image of the beast is set up. And in between this time period is this test that's going to take place. and you get your results at the Sunday law. So this formalization in 2021 is the formalization on the 144,000. But as we can see, the priest line has ended, and there's two lines that we still have. It's the line of the Levites and the line of the Nethinims. And on the line of the Levites and Nethinims, it's an unsealing of a message. So while it's the formalization of the line of the 144,000, there's a Boston taking place, if we use that Boston Concord Exeter model, on the line of the Levites and the Nethinims. So these waymarks that we have in between Panem and the Sunday law, I would suggest we have to understand them in relation to the Levites and the Nethinims, as opposed to primarily. I think they play a part in the line of the 144,000, but at a structural level, they're here on the line of the Levites and the Nethinims. So when we get to a formalization, just in general, does light stop its development? So let's go to 2018, where Elder Tess gives the midnight cry in Arkansas. Does the message stop developing between then and the next major waymark, which would be Raffia, November 9, 2019? No, we recognize that the midnight cry continues to develop in between that time period. Another example is in 1833, which is the formalization for William Miller. He gets his preaching credentials. The fundamental truths that were formalized by Miller are developed. And Litch does a study using the principles that were developed by William Miller and established and formalized in 1833 to make a prediction of the fall of the Ottoman Empire in the next waymark. So in that time period between a formalization and the shut door or the big waymark that's coming next, there's still this growth of the truth. When we think of the loud cry, it doesn't get to a point where it reaches its peak and just stop, it continues on. And so the reason why I bring that up is because what do we associate with the formalization on the line of the 144,000? What message do we tie to this waymark? Formalization 2021. There was a study done by Elder Tess, and there was a specific study that was done. What study was that? If anyone remembers. And the date.
I can't remember. Was it LGBTQ?
I think that was on the line of the priests. So yeah, LGBTQ in
Understanding,
2021. Pardon, sorry?
understanding feminism.
So there was a feminism, yes, but a specific ideology within feminism, which was radical feminism, if we can
Yeah,
just put
that,
it like that.
yeah, that's the name of the study. So I
Okay.
gave you the name
Okay.
of the
Yes.
study.
Okay. Yeah. My bad. But yeah, the study was called Understanding Feminism, but the key theme was radical feminism. So we get to this point, and it's formalizing this message that's going to bring you to the Sunday law. But at the same time, a message is unsealed for the Levites and for the Nethinims. And so when we mark these waymarks and their external dates, and we mark internal, and we give them dates, the dates that we give them and that we have given them in the past, are they for the external events or for the internal development of truth? I think this study was done on sometime like 27 to 30. It was during a camp meeting, 27 to something October. But with all other waymarks, what dates do we associate with those waymarks? Is it the internal or the external?
Don't understand the question.
The external.
Yeah. So the question was, Natalie, when we mark dates, 9/11, November 9, and all the other dates, don't know, December 19 in 2018, May 25 in 2020, when we mark all those dates, they are, as Andres pointed out, they're the development of things that are happening politically, that are happening externally. What we do see when we think about this development of truth internally is that around these dates, around these waymarks, there's a specific truth that's building up, that's developing. We don't associate those dates of the waymarks with the internal development of truth. And the reason why is because prophecy is the prophetic delineation of events in history and in politics that bring you to the close of this earth's history. So it's meant to give you guidance as to where you are in history. And the only way you can know where you are in history is by looking at what's around you in the world, at politics. What's happening internally is this story of redemption, of God redeeming their people, of building up their people through these different tests, if you want to call it, up until Jesus comes, because it's building the character of God's people. So internally, it's a story of redemption that takes place in the sphere of a waymark. As with 2016, for instance, we have the Battle of Ipsus and November 9 and the election related to that waymark as being the date associated with that waymark. But when we look at the internal truth that's developed, we don't have a date for that. We just say in that time period, there was a truth that was opening up. In 2018, we mark December 19 as the date associated for that waymark, but the truth was developing between September and October time period, where Albertus is doing his studies in Arkansas and France and etc. And so my point in all of that, and you can see the same pattern reflected in all the other preceding waymarks, is
Yeah.
that, yeah,
2016, we had a massive gem opened up, and that was Daniel 11 with
Mhm.
Charles and Kimberly. That was about the king
Yeah.
of the south. So that was massive. And I put that at 2016.
yeah. And my point is that we just place it in 2016, but the date, as in the specific day and month that we associate with the waymark, is the external events. We recognize that around those external events, internally, as you've pointed out, there's this development of truth for us as God's people, internally, that we need to recognize as God is trying to redeem us, i.e., trying to build us up into the people that God wants us to be. That was my key point from that. But yeah, that just added to what I was trying to say. So now, when we look at these, if we're going to find dates for this waymark and this waymark, it was my suggestion that we need to think of them as in relation to the Levites and the Netherlands. Sorry, not dates, the development of truth internally. Because now we're part of the 144,000. So we've had our formalization of the message here at Panium. But now there's something that's meant to prepare the Nethinims for their harvest, because this is their latter rain. So they're meant to be prepared for their harvest. And there's a truth that's meant to harvest the Levites. And they have to be related to the upcoming waymark, which would be Daniel 11, verse 41, the Sunday law. Are we clear on that before I go on to the next step? That these waymarks that we have in between Panium and the Sunday law are on the line of the Levites in their harvest, the line of the Nethinims, their latter rain. And they have to be, the truths that are opening up at those waymarks have to be in relation to those groups and their preparation for the upcoming waymark, which is the Sunday law. Okay. So now when we think about this time period, we mark, how can I draw it? We mark 273 at this point. in this waymark, yeah. 273. And that's this ambassadorial exchange. It's been suggested, and I've suggested the same thing, that the development of truth in that time period were the studies that Elder Tess was doing during her Vespers studies. And when I've looked through those Vespers studies and tried to find what the underlying theme was, what the primary subject matter was, I know she framed it as understanding our switch from right wing to left wing, and then understanding the left wing and where we fit in the left wing. And I'd encourage you to do the same thing, so you're not just taking my word for it, is track what the key point was in all of that. If you want to understand where we are on the left, we have to understand, I'm suggesting, the dragon. We have to understand libertarianism. So her studies, when it was talking about Max, Max Bloom, I can't remember his name, but Max, when it was
Right.
talking about the horsemen, yeah, go on.
Now, I was saying Max was actually a pseudonym. It wasn't his real name.
Yeah.
Blumenthal was a different guy.
Yeah. That's why I caught myself. But yeah, the pseudonym Max, whether it was understanding atheism, whether it was understanding freedom over equality, all of that centered around this ideology of the dragon. The majority of the studies dealt with understanding this, because I had wondered why in this threefold union we had clarity on apostate Protestantism, whether it was studies on the moral majority or the National Reform Association in 1863, or everything that is related to apostate Protestantism. We had pretty clear insight into that aspect of the threefold union. The papacy, we have the line of the counterfeit. And so now, what about the dragon? We didn't understand much about the dragon. And I see it so fitting that in the time period where you have the seventh kingdom rising, we have studies that are giving you insight into the ideology of the dragon, which is libertarianism or atheism, however you want to put it. And so now we're in a time period where light is going to be shining on this third member, the dragon. And this is all in the context of this elaboration of radical feminism. So Elder Tess does her studies on Vespers, and it's going in on libertarianism. I'm just going to use that as the title for that series of studies. And round about the same period of time, Elder Parminder starts his own series of studies, where it's going to lead us to now start questioning or understanding the relationship between liberal feminism and radical feminism. So while we tie the statement, the personal is political, to radical feminism, we can now understand and see how political actions are done by liberal feminists. So they take that same brand and employ it in a political way because they're political actors. So when did Elder Tess finish her studies? 24 June. I think I've suggested that 24 June, 24 June 2022. It's a culmination of these Vespers of studies. I'm not tying her studies to this waymark. I'm just using that as a marker, as representing those studies. And in the same period of time, Elder Parminder, as I've suggested, is doing his own series of studies. And in May in 2022, May 14, 2022, he brings up the subject of voting. And the necessity to vote, because as participants in the field, you have to be observers as well as participants, i.e. actors in this whole great controversy battle. And he ties this to feminism. So while feminism is being formalized on the line of the 144,000, it's being unsealed for the Levites. And I'm suggesting that the key thing that the Levites need to start understanding from this point on, that's going to bring them to their test, is the relationship between radical feminism, and in particular, voting. Because as we take the symbol of Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurgis and tie that to the Sunday law, and amidst other studies, we see that the marker for the Sunday law isn't going to be this law passed by the state anymore. It's going to be voting. So if Levites are going to be harvested and recognize that the Sunday law is here, they need to understand this development of truth, i.e. voting. That's internally. That's what's happening internally in this development of truth. So I'm not saying that May 14 is the development of truth. I'm just associating how understanding libertarianism is us understanding radical feminism, is us understanding voting, all in the context of this development of truth that we expect between Panium and the Sunday law. At the same time, where I think we should be marking our external events, we have the rise of the Seventh Kingdom. And it's this date, June 24, 2022, that I've suggested is the marker for that waymark. And so what should we look for in that waymark? We should look for this alliance that we spoke about, this ideological alliance, as the rise of this dragon is taking place. And so let's go to the founding of America to think of what took place at its beginning that brings us to the point where we can now understand what the ideology of the dragon is going to take place. I started off by saying that this is a struggle to define America's identity when we think of the culture war that's going on. It's not just who Americans are, but what America stands for as a nation. And so when you have your founders set foot in America, they're running away from monarchy and they want to start a new form of government, which led to this ongoing debate that we see in every single history and through every single controversy, whether it's political, legal, or moral, it's the same issue over and over and over again. In the 1790s, you had the founding of a two-party system in America. You had the Federalists on one side. You had the Federalists. And you had the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists dissolves into nothing as time goes on. But your Democratic Republicans, if I can simply say, are the basis for the two parties that exist today in America. But your Federalists, which included Alexander Hamilton, posed arguments that, okay, I understand that we're running away from monarchy, but we still need a strong central government. We need a strong central bank if we're going to have a successful nation. So while we don't want to create a king, we still recognize the necessity of a strong central government. And you had your Democratic Republicans, which was led by Thomas Jefferson and others, who are now going to champion this ideology opposed to this strong central government, a federal government that's going to rule over all the states. There were a few states at that time, and as it grew, this argument that's being made by your Democratic Republicans is going to go along the lines of states should have their own rights. States should govern themselves. States should be able to make their own laws without the federal government coming in to tell us what to do, essentially. This argument was particularly made by your southern states because it was an agrarian economy. They owned cotton fields and wheat fields and etc. They had strong ties to France, and they felt that if we had a strong central government, then all the wealth that we're generating, because at that time that's where the wealth was, it wouldn't be fair to take that wealth and then spread it to the north. And Alexander Hamilton says, actually, let's have a national bank where we all put our money in and then spread that around. And so you get to the Constitutional Convention, and there's this argument that goes back and forth for a strong government, which is going to be defended by Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. And you have your anti-federalists who have a valid concern that too much federal power would threaten the independence of your individual states, and we just end up back at the point that they're running away from monarchy, tyranny. And so you end up with compromises, and that's how you get this two-part legislature. You have Congress and Senate. That was all devised because of compromise between the two. The 10th Amendment, which ensures that states, if I can put it very simply, states can stand on their own 2 feet. But in each of the tests that we've discussed that bring us to today, I'd suggest that this is the battle that's been raged from the very beginning. And the consequence of that battle is all these human rights issues that we see. Those weren't the primary concerns that were being addressed by the champions of said causes. What they were concerned about was the relationship between the states and the federal government, the identity of America. In 1850, that's the first test that we discuss. In 1850, I know we shy away from the idea that that issue wasn't about slavery, but at least from what I've looked into, I think there's a strong case to be made that the primary concern that the southern states had was this balance of power between states and the federal government. So yes, slavery was part of that story and was the main moral and human rights issue of the day, and we highlight that. The political argument was really about who had the final say. Was it the states or the federal government? And I'll make this case because it's the same argument that existed when America was being founded. And you just see it demonstrated again and again and again. Who has power, states or federal government? And that's the libertarian argument. So at the beginning, when we spoke about what libertarianism is, we discussed it with regards to individuals' freedom. So my freedom or your freedom to pursue happiness, etc. But at a political level, at a nation level, in America, it was, do states have the freedom to decide what they want for themselves, as opposed to this big central government, the federal government. And it did not start in 1850, it's been the story from the beginning. And then we get to 1888. And there were a series of studies that were done about how the Constitution became Christian. And in summary, there was this constant battle in how the Constitution became Christian over defining the identity of America. And if we had a bit more time, we can demonstrate how this revolved around the same issue of states' rights and federal rights. There were moral issues associated with these things because that's always the consequence of libertarianism, is that they impact human rights. If we go to the civil rights history, libertarians were arguing that you can't force a hotel to accept Black patrons. But they weren't arguing it from a point of being racist explicitly. They were arguing it from a point of this freedom argument. And so libertarians are going to make arguments not primarily from the issue of wanting to infringe human rights or these moral issues, but from wanting to protect this idea of freedom. At America's level, it's wanting to protect state freedom. So we have 1850, we have 1888, and then we get to today. And it's at this point, Q73, Egypt, libertarian, is going to send ambassadors to Rome. And I'm not sure how I can describe that. It's, let's just say, a moral issue. So Rome represents moral issues, and the dragon is standing there representing state issues, so political issues. I'm sure I can frame that better, but for now, let's just go with that. So at this point, let's think back on what happened in Dobbs v. Jackson, because at least I've tried to demonstrate that Dobbs v. Jackson is the political event that marks 273. What was in the mind of the Supreme Court justices that overturned Roe v. Wade? I suggest that it's a reflection of this continued historical debate over how power is distributed between the federal government and the states. And in all that, it's this battle between how the Constitution should be defined. Should we use originalism to define the Constitution, or should we use living constitutionalism to define the Constitution? When the US Constitution was created, it created this federal government, as we know, where power is divided between the federal government and your states. And the founders designed this system to reflect the fact that these states can govern for themselves. Again, reminding us, running away from monarchy, they don't want to create a king. So they give power to states to decide things for themselves, while still recognizing, at least on Alexander Hamilton's part, that it's important to have this strong federal government. Before Roe v. Wade, the original court case, took place in 1973, before all that, abortion was regulated entirely at a state level. So I'm just describing history at this point. And the laws varied between the different states. By the 19th century, many of the states had criminalized abortion. And so when the Supreme Court decided Roe in 1973, it nationalized abortion rights by interpreting the 14th Amendment in a specific way, et cetera, and it encompasses a woman's right to choose abortion for herself. So it's now going to be a federal issue. So they've taken it from it being a state issue, and they said this is a federal issue, because within the due process clause of 14th Amendment, that right is embedded within that. And so when the majority give their ruling in Dobbs v. Jackson, the argument that they're making is that abortion should be left to the states because the Constitution doesn't explicitly address abortion. That's what they had originally, under originalism, agreed to, that if something is not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution, then the states should decide it for themselves. And so Justice Alito wrote in his majority, in his majority argument, that the court's role in law isn't to impose single policy solutions, but in his mind, it's to allow the democratic process to operate. And so this reflects that thinking that Thomas Jefferson had, the idea that states should have autonomy to address policy issues, not explicitly within federal jurisdiction. So you have these two ways of interpreting the Constitution coming to head. Originalism, are you going to stick to the document as it was originally written with regards to the rights that were mentioned there? Or are you going to use living constitutionalism to recognize that while some rights weren't explicitly defined in the Constitution originally, we as a society can recognize 100 years later that, hold on, even though this wasn't written by the founders, the underlying principle still needs to be maintained. That's what originalism and living constitutionalism is. The primary undergirding of originalism is this: states should have their own rights. So if you want to think about Justice Clarence Thomas, Justice Alito, and all the other conservative Supreme Court justices that ruled in favor of overturning Roe v. Wade, I don't know what their personal political opinions are on abortion. What I do know is that their primary argument is not coming from a moral point of view. For all we know, Justice Thomas couldn't care less about whether women have abortions or not. What he is driven by is states' rights. He is driven by this ideology, this libertarian ideology, and this libertarian argument. And he's been waiting for this moment to return that decision to the states. Hence why that decision was return the decision to the states. It wasn't no abortions, it was let states decide. What we see, though, in the aftermath, as we do with every libertarian argument that we do see, is that the result of that is that human rights are violated down the road. So here's your libertarian argument: states' rights being made by Egypt. Your Catholic Church or apostate Protestantism says no, abortion equals evil. Your moral argument. And here's two ideologies that have two separate agendas. Rome wants to enforce this moral imprint on society. Egypt wants freedom, wants its America to look like what it did at the beginning: libertarianism, originalism. And they meet here in the middle. They start forming their alliance because despite them coming from two different perspectives, they come to the same place where now abortion in all those states is going to be criminalized. And I think in the previous election, I can't remember how many states had it on the ballot, but the majority of them chose to criminalize abortion on some level. So you have the same result, despite coming with two different agendas. Does that make sense? I spoke for a really long time, so I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So, as I said, this is the result. This alliance starts being formed because you have two ideologies that meet in the middle, despite them having different agendas. And now we get to, this was the increase of knowledge. Externally, this is the event associated with that increase of knowledge: Dobbs v. Jackson, libertarianism, and the ideology of Rome. And when we get here to the formalization, a reminder: who is being tested in this dispensation? Who's being harvested? Whose job is it to recognize this development of truth? Because if they recognize it, they can see what's coming next. And as we saw, it's Levites. It's Levites who are being harvested here. So it's this way, Mark, that they're meant to see, and they're going to be tested by, to see the Sunday law that's coming, much like we had it in 9/11, where in 1996, if you saw line upon line and you saw Daniel 11, verse 40 to 45, then you're going to be able to recognize 9/11 when it happens. So if you understand this development of truth, you're going to see this waymark. If you don't, then you're not going to see that waymark coming.
Curtis?
Mhm.
Didn't you before say the Levites have to see voting, and now you're saying they have to see Dobs?
No, I said that this is, so Dobbs is the external event. When we talk about external and internal, external is related to political things, it's related to what's happening out there. Internally is the development of a message that's going to prepare you for something else. So the example I gave was between 1989 and 2001. Internally, we had line upon line, Daniel 11 verse 45. And if you understood Daniel 11 verse 45, you would understand what's happening next. So here, between 2021 and the Sunday law, externally, it's Dobbs v. Jackson. Internally, it's this understanding of libertarianism, or understanding the role that voting plays as a radical feminist, because radical feminism and liberal feminism, they can't be separated in its entirety. It's feminism at its core. So
How do
if Levites,
Levites see voting internally?
hence why we don't have any Levites here. That was what the message to them was supposed to be, or is. And they're not harvested into the movement. And the fact that they're not harvested into the movement, they don't see this development of the dragon. They don't see this development of radical feminism as it relates to libertarianism, as it relates to voting. And so this is, again, another one of the reasons why there are no Levites, is because they don't see this truth being developed. For whatever
So
reason, they're not in the movement. Pardon, sorry?
Why do they have to see Dobs if they don't see voting?
Dobbs is the external event. So everyone has to see these external events. Whatever external event that we are going to associate with the formalization, Lethanims, priests, or well, priest line has ended, 144,000. External events are just there to give you guidance as to where you are in history. With regards to God preparing a people, it's the internal message that does that work. Prior to, or between 2014 and 2019, we've made the point that we weren't doing our work for the Levites and for the Nethinims, because they were in their plowing, they were in their early rain, etc. And so God is going to use the stones being external, the Democrats, the politics of the day, etc. But now we've got to a point where they can't be the leaders of those two movements anymore. It has to be us, or specifically the Nethinims. It has to be us who's leading them. So the people that are giving that message is us, the movement, the message that's meant to harvest the Levites. They don't hear the message, this internal truth. Let's just call it Vespers as the thing at the increase of knowledge. They don't hear this internal increase of knowledge that we have during the Vesper studies, during Alpaminda studies about voting, and they don't hear this study at the formalization that packages everything that leads up to the Sunday law. To you, Natalie.
Are you giving me a question?
I'm just asking if you're satisfied.
I agree that
Okay.
the Levites have to see Dobbs externally. They have to see the gender issue, abortion.
Yeah, I'm not disputing that. I just want us to recognize this internal development of truth. Everyone has to see external events, but to be harvested into this movement, it's not enough to be on the right side of those external events. You have to accept the things that we're teaching. And again, why this is a big issue for Levites, and why I would suggest is the development of truth that they're meant to recognize if they're going to come into this movement at this point, is because of the taboo that voting has been for Adventism. I think their current position as an institution is just do according to your conscience or something like that. Whereas now Alpaminda is going to do studies and suggest that you're required to vote. You're required to see voting as necessary as a participant in the field. And so now going to the formalization, I'm of the belief that the studies done by Alberteri were the thing that formalized this issue of voting. And when you try and understand a series of studies in that time period, of whether you want to call it April or May, whichever time period, as I've suggested, truth develops around a waymark. It's not the marker for a waymark. The key thing that's being addressed in those studies isn't the date of the Sunday law, because as with every Exeter, the date is just like a bonus. It's not the thing that you're being tested on. Time was a test between 2001 and 2014. After that point at Exeter, now you're going to see time as a component of Exeter, but it's not the issue that's dividing two classes of people. And so the key thing that I see coming out of those studies by Alberteri is the association of voting to the Sunday law, is the fact that voting is now a marker for the Sunday law. And so if Adventism or Levites specifically don't recognize that, don't recognize the necessity of voting, they aren't able to see the Sunday law when it comes. And so they fail that test and are not harvested into this movement, because all their markers for the Sunday law are just thrown away. Now we have a new marker being made for the Sunday law. And it's this development of, as I'm suggesting, voting in its relation to feminism and feminism in its relation to the Sunday law. That is the thing that is meant to harvest the Levites. Any questions?
I do have one. So it's relating to the 273 and Dobs versus Jackson.
That's external.
Yeah. So I really see the logic. I think this is something like I thought that came up. What if, so let's say, so are you saying that the failure of the US was that they relegated the federal government, relegated the decision or left the decision to the states, and that was in itself the failure, which led to the unintended consequence of human rights being violated in some of the states. And so I'm wondering.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I answer that question?
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, not answer, but try to understand more about the question. Is when we talk about the failure of the United States, failure in whose eyes? Because I'd make the suggestion that this is a success on the part of, if we see the US as Satan's kingdom, this is a success for the seventh kingdom, because this is the rise of the seventh kingdom. So this is the seventh kingdom showing you what it's all about. It's this dragon that you have.
Yeah, so failure in the eyes of the lamb, let's say, like it ceases to speak as a lamb and it's speaking as a dragon now. Like
Again, I don't know how to look at that, because the sixth kingdom is still Satan's kingdom. So it's just they're all Satan's kingdoms that change their leadership over time. I know we look at the lamb-like beast that comes up in 1798, but just like Babylon was the king of the north and was meant to protect God's people at some point, it's still Satan's kingdom. Or if we look at Rome in the time of the Jews, the disciples and Jesus and etc., that was still the king of the north, but it was meant to protect God's people. But they end up persecuting God's people. So it's still Satan's kingdom, but the lamb-like beast is Satan's kingdom, supposed to protect God's people, but ends up persecuting them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because I was gonna say then, like, if kind of like thinking of like, hey, what would God want? Would in the decision of Dobbs versus Jackson, do we where should we stand? You know, like, should we agree with it or disagree? Because if, let's say, we disagree with it and we say no, the federal government should decide, and that's the right decision, then what if the federal government gets it wrong, you know, and they decide no, abortion should be illegal?
So the way I've seen it is understanding originalism and living constitutionalism. That the point of living constitutionalism is that you have these words that are written in the Constitution, but these words have underlying principles. So to protect various human rights. And as society got more woke, if we can put it that way, they would recognize that there's all these other things that should be protected that weren't explicitly referenced in the Constitution. So if America had made it a federal mandate to protect abortion, which they never did, all they did was interpret the Constitution in a specific way, but they never passed any amendments. They never did anything to the Constitution to ratify it. They just went with the assumption that precedent would be enough. So if they had gone that way, I think they would have been doing the part of they would have been playing the part of the protector of God's people by recognizing that the principles of abortion being protected were in the founding documents already. That's how I see it, at least.
Yeah, so it would be kind of like more, it's kind of like a double test, like in the sense that not only do we need a federal government deciding those things, but we need them to make the right decision. If any of those two components fail, then it doesn't work.
Because you could have the federal government instituting a Sunday law. So there's something where we believe that we should have a strong federal government, but now they're deciding something that we don't agree with. So there's multiple stories at play, or multiple ways in which that story could play out.
Yeah.
As Charity wrote, the Glorious Land had different jobs in maintaining living constitutionalism and maintaining this balance, because let's just say a strong federal government. If that strong executive branch or that strong federal government gets too strong, then it just turns into tyranny. It just turns into a king, which is kind of what's happened. There's so much power in the executive branch that the founders didn't intend for it to have. And Justice Clarence Thomas sees this and says, this is absurd. But in seeing that absurd, his worldview is going to bring you to a point where you have bad outcomes anyway. Justice Clarence Thomas is black. And in the court case where affirmative action was overturned, he voted to overturn it. Is Justice Thomas Clarence racist against black people? I don't think so. I think that he is just so driven by this ideology to protect how America was intended to be founded that it results in things that, again, I don't know what his personal opinion is about race relations and etc. but it leads to positions that on the surface seem like not precisely what he's arguing for or against.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. That makes sense.
So, yeah, those studies that we have in 2024 in the April-May time period, I'm suggesting that it's voting and its relation to Sunday law, but even more than that, it's voting and its relationship to Trumpism, i.e., the Republican Party takeover. This ideology that had been building from 1989 up until you get to the Sunday law. We have an ideology that's going to fuel us, which is radical feminism, if we can entail everything that the stone stands for and everything that radical feminism talks about. That's the ideology that's going to tell its story, that brings you to a point where it's able to smash the statue, starts at 1989 and brings you to that point. And in the same breath, you have Trumpism just as an ideology from 1989 that brings you to the point where that ideology is formalized. I'm going to paraphrase something that Elder Parminder said in a recent study. He pointed out that I've shown the case why. I'm just giving a paraphrase of him. Understanding the issue of voting being the marker for the Sunday law would help us come to an understanding why the Adventist Church could never come to a place where they could locate the Sunday law. And so they don't locate the Sunday law because they haven't gone through this development of truth, of understanding libertarianism, understanding feminism. And if you understand feminism, you understand voting and the necessity of voting and the markers associated with the Sunday law being voting. I'm wrapping up now. I appreciate that time has run out. And so after this internal development of truth, and this relationship between power, how power is used, whether it's talking about libertarianism, whether it's talking about voting, it's all under the umbrella of feminism, radical feminism, because the key thing that's being broached or addressed by radical feminism, this principle, is how either individuals or nations should relate to power in collective decision making, in societal decisions, etc., and the effect of the top down and the effect of individuals affecting the top. To wrap up and bring us to where I wanted us to bring to. When we think about the Sunday law and the cry that's made for the Sunday law, I'd like to go back to Israel and think about those that cried for a king when they cried for Saul. What are they crying for? They're crying for America's identity to be defined in a certain way. America to be made great again, because in that period where America was great, it exhibited a specific idea, a specific ethos. And so this dragon, the seventh kingdom, is going to come to a point where it reflects that ideology. And you have three factions or three groups or entities with different agendas who arrive at the same conclusion: patriarchy, a patriarchal worldview. And so the core principle uniting in our story of Pyrrhus, Egypt, and the king of the north is this relationship between individuals and collective arrangement of power. Whether you're looking at it from a moral point of view, whether you're looking at it from a libertarian point of view, it all culminates in the same point. So when we get to the Sunday law, we've spoken about Egypt sending ambassadors to Rome. When we get to the Sunday law and Rome are now going to send ambassadors back to Egypt to consolidate that power, and we have the symbol of Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges. At the Sunday law, we have Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurges, and Here we have voting. And here we have flood. This is all in the story of an alliance. So when we get to that point, to understand this symbol and everything that voting means or the flood means, we have to understand it in this story of a threefold union, of an alliance that's being made. That's the context. And so the vote in this story can't be related to a choice being made. It has to be related to voting in the context of an alliance that's being made between three groups that establish a threefold union. It's fundamental to the way that we approach Bible study. That your symbols you take are defined in their context. You can't take context from somewhere else. So the story of a great test, and take that to define your symbol that you're taking from another story. You have to look at that symbol in that story and understand the thread in that story, and then you can define that symbol.
Sure.
Someone want to say something?
I think earlier on you said that you would go to the context of Quintus Fabius Maxus Scourgus, and you have to, like the flood, for instance, you have to look at the context of that, and then you can see if you can apply it as a symbol.
When I said the context, I meant the context that this person is involved in. So the context that this person, QFMG, is in is he is an ambassador that's being sent to Egypt to go and solidify an alliance that had started a year before in 273, where ambassadors were sent to his nation. That's what I meant by context. So that's the context, that's the story. All context is a story. So story equals alliance. That's the context.
How do we pull out voting and stuff from that then and apply it to the Sunday law? Because the story is alliance, not voting.
Yes, so this is the story. That's the history, the natural history that took place. Now we want to get this person, and we want to, and we want to understand the different elements of this person's name, etc. And in that story, these individual things mean something. So it meant maximum, it meant flood, it meant etc. Now we're going to make application. So when we make application, we take this story, alliance, we come to today.
What type of alliance was it?
Pardon, sorry?
Do you know what type of alliance it was?
In
That he
the
made?
literal application, it was an alliance of kingdoms,
Okay.
of countries. In application, as we already understand, I'm not saying something new, when we speak about the alliance of the King of the North and the dragon, we're speaking of an ideological alliance. That's something that we've already gone through. Alliance.
So we changed nations, alliance of nations, into alliance of ideology. Well, you have.
Yes. From history into application. Like we do with
Yeah, but in
law.
doing that, you've
We
changed. I know what you're doing. You're taking it from history into application, but you've changed what
from
they
literal
said was
into
in
spiritual.
history. You've changed the
I'm
meaning
going,
because you've changed
yeah,
the meaning of the alliance from nations
I've
to.
taken entities. So there's an entity, which is Rome. There's an entity, which is Egypt. Those are two entities. We know it's not something that I'm trying to demonstrate. If we want, we can do a study of who the King of the North represents and who Egypt represents. And those are entities again. And those entities are driven by ideologies. And so going from literal to spiritual, I'm making the suggestion that the literal is literally let's work together, and the spiritual is this ideological alliance.
I disagree, but carry on.
Okay. So that's the context. A story of an alliance. So when we unpackage this name, QFMG, and you have voting as in that unpackaged name, and we want to make application of this, we have to see it in this context. The story that the original symbol is taken from. And then the original symbol, it's a vote that establishes an alliance that you have. It's not a choice that's being made between good stream and bad stream. It's not a vote that marks a test. It's a vote that creates something, I'm going to say image of the beast, and establishes this coming together of worldviews. So I've gone over time by 15 minutes, but if you would give me 5 minutes to just go to one more story, if you'd allow me. Daniel 11, verse 41.
Okay.
40 and 41. I'm just going to post it in the chat. It's a verse that we should all know well. This is describing the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. The king of the north comes against the king of the south and describes it as the king of the north coming like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, ships, and entering into the countries and overflowing and passing over, i.e., totally wiping out the king of the south. Would someone like to articulate what role the king of the north played in the fall of the king of the south in 1989? What in application, what actually happened? If someone can describe that history. Anyone? Because we just say that the king of the north, brought down the king of the south, but
Is it
what
George
did that?
Senior overflowed countries?
Yeah, but what does that mean? So
Um,
Manjit has written, they gave money, intel, equipment to who? To do what? Like, do we even recognize what that looked like? Okay. You can hear what I have to say, and then you can think about it, and then look into if this is actually what played out. Is that the USSR, which was the king of the South, like the United States, was this union of smaller political entities. It had about 15 Soviet republics, and each of them had their own small government with their own small constitutions and their own small defined borders within the Eastern Bloc, as man just put in the chat. And one key difference between that and the USA is that while these republics in this coalition resemble the USA or US states, because as we described earlier, each state has their own government, can make their own decisions, etc., as part of a larger federal government. In the USSR, the autonomy was pretty much symbolic because power was centralized in Moscow under the Communist Party. But when you get to the fall of the USSR, and we think of these republics, what happened in 1991 and the lead up to 1991 is that these states began pulling away. So they started pushing back over the central government because of the money, the information, and I'm going to suggest primarily the ideology that had been fed to the protesters in those states over that Cold War period. So the King of the North is fighting an information war with Russia with regards to who's going to be the world superpower. The USA wants the USSR out the way to be a unipolar world. It's fighting against communism, and they're going to give money to protesters in those states, and they're going to paint the West or the United States way of government as a better form of government, as the way in which they should go. And so it's just this constant propaganda that's fed to these states over a period of time, up until you get to 1989 and 1991, where these states start declaring sovereignty. You had Lithuania, Ukraine, Georgia, etc. And the way that they declared their sovereignty, after having been influenced by the King of the North's ideology, is that they hold votes. They hold referendums. A referendum is where the people in that nation vote on a specific issue. So in the majority of those states, they had referendums, but in others, they had parliamentary votes. So in parliaments in those states, they voted whether to leave the USSR, that union. So the fall of the USSR was brought about through these states voting to leave, and this gradual unraveling in those states one by one as they each voted to leave the USSR gained momentum after a coup that happened, etc., etc. And it culminated finally when the last nation voted, I think it was Russia, voted to leave the USSR, and eventually it dissolved in 1991. So you have these states who vote to leave the USSR, and that brings the King of the South to its death in 1991. I'm just reiterating, an ideology is used by the King of the North to influence those states that your life would be better if you adopted this ideology. And so they buy into that ideology for various reasons. And the USSR states, smaller states, decide to leave. And the mechanism that they use to leave is votes, either through referendums or in parliament. And then we get to verse 41. I am finishing, I promise. We get to verse 41, and it describes, now the King of the North has taken care of the King of the South, has defeated the King of the South. It couldn't have go on to its next conquest until it defeated the King of the South. And it says, and he shall enter into the glorious land. Many countries, we put the word people, shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand. Edom, Moab, Ammon, chief children of Ammon, etc. So how is the King of the North going to fight? It's going to fight by infiltrating the minds of the people that it's targeting to get them to a point where they choose to follow a particular ideology. So in the first story of the King of the South being killed, it was votes that killed the King of the South as these states voted. And I think I'm on public record of suggesting that I think it's July 18, 2024, as the Sunday Law, is the same mechanism where it's the culmination of these votes that had been done by states in the primaries leading up to July. So from January, you had all these states voting that have bought into this ideology of the King of the North. And now it's the final point where those states coalesce around a specific ideology. So just bringing everything that we've spoken about, it's, in my eyes, I see Daniel 11 verse 41 reflecting how the King of the South fell to how the glorious land falls, because it's the states that vote. And on July 18, the states voted to embrace a particular ideology. You have a threefold union. I didn't go into how we see that threefold union at the Sunday Law, but if we can just think about it as three ideologies, and I think Elder Terry has fleshed this out and done a much better job than I can. at seeing how 3 different ideologies chose to surround themselves around Trumpism, around Trump, the seventh kingdom.
So you saying the King of the South has already fallen by July 18th, and it was brought about by the voting in Trumpism?
This story is about the King of the North in relation to the internal battle, the Eastern Front. As with every other waymark, there's stories that take place on the Eastern Front and on the Western Front, and they don't always align in sync. There's dates related to other things that take place in those stories. I'm talking about this particular story in relation to the King of the North against itself, or the USA. So the King of the South is a different story.
Yeah, but you brought us to 1989 and you were showing us how the Soviet Union fell. And then I thought you were going to bring us to verse 41 and show us how it fell in what you're saying.
Verse 41 is about the King of the North and the glorious land. There's nothing mentioned in verse 41 about the King of the South.
Why did you bring in the fall of the King of the South in 1989?
To show how it fell in 1989.
Do you think it's already fallen?
Not gonna answer that, because that's not my study.
Is it because it's because he's entering the glorious land in the same way that he dismantled the USSR, the King of the South, in verse 40. Sorry, have you finished your point? Because I wanted to ask a question about that. He's talking about threefold union.
No, you can ask your question.
I was thinking about this as well, because I think you or Elder Chair, I can't remember, somebody alluded to the fact that he'll do it in the same way, and I was wrestling with the whole economic ships and chariots. What application are you making of that, or you're not? You know, because it's sort of said, when you said, how did the King of the North do it? I was thinking, how did he do it? Because kind of used economic and military threat in the background, even though it wasn't a hot war. There was that power in the background. And I know we're kind of saying Trump has used economics to a degree. So I don't know whether there's, we could just use the same thing. Go on.
So what was the key target of the US propaganda machine? It was to unsettle the people. And how do you get people to fight against their government? Often the case is when America wants people to protest a government, sure, they impose sanctions on said government. And I know we like to say, but they aren't putting sanctions on the people. The effect is that the people feel those sanctions. And so the economic might that we see throughout the Cold War, there were numerous sanctions that were placed on the USSR, and life just became unbearable in those various states as in relation to the central government of the USSR. They armed them and etc. But that was all to bring them to a point where they decide, we're not going to be part of this regime anymore. We're going to be allied to the West, to the King of the North, because that's an ideology that I believe in. So I think all those extra things were like extra add-ons, incentives for you to buy into my ideology as the King of the North. Economically, life is difficult for you, and etc. Yeah, blessing. I think that was you.
Yeah. Could I just say something about that King of the North? Because I've questioned this for some years now, which is the idea of the King of the North coming against the King of the South with chariots, horsemen, and many ships. I know we've traditionally applied it to economy, but and I'm not saying, the United States doesn't use economic means in its warfare, but when looking at the symbols, were those trade ships or warships? Because I guess that's the question that I've had for a long time, that the context of the verse is war. The King of the North is going to fight on land and on sea. That's the understanding I guess I've developed over time. That this and we know the nature of war in our history is primarily information propaganda. So it seems to me that verse 40 has less to do with when I say less to do with trade, like again, I'm not saying trade is not part of the war, but I'm saying I don't think the ships there represent economic might or trade per se, but rather are part of the same arsenal. It's just another tool in the military warfare, you know, that the
Yeah.
King of the North wages. So yeah, we could look into that more another time, but I just thought to mention it since it was asked.
Okay. Yeah, it's 12:30, so I'm going to wrap up. And each of these different topics that I've discussed, I think, warrant further exploration. I know that we didn't get the chance to go into each of those different steps in detail, but the key thing that I wanted to bring out was this dispensation between Panium and the Sunday Law is a dispensation where we're learning more about the dragon, as we had pretty much understood the role that the moral majority or apostate Protestantism plays in that threefold union. We understand the counterfeit. We didn't have much light on the dragon, and this dispensation shone light on the dragon in that threefold union. And while it shone light on the dragon in that threefold union, it shone light on the nature of voting and its relationship to the Sunday law as a marker of the Sunday law waymark. And so Levites and their necessity to see voting as that symbol is part of the reason why there's no Levites. There's no recognition of that that being the symbol of the Sunday law. And in that symbol should be understood in the context of a threefold union, not in the context of a choice that's being made between two streams. We want to tell a story about a choice that's being made between two streams. There's other models that can do that. I'm suggesting Pyrrhus in that story isn't it, or Quintus Fabius Maximus Gurgis isn't it. Yeah, because I'm just going to end on this point, because I think a lot of what we expect at a Boston from the models that we've built, I don't think we can just now run away from those models. We can't tie a choice to Boston because we've never done that. Choices are made at Exeter. And the choice that is made at Exeter, I've said this before and I'm saying it again, is not between the image of the beast and the Democrats. It's not between Trump and Democrats. It's not between the left and the right. It's between who's going to be harvested into this kingdom. And so the right choice has to be this movement. It can't be Democrats and it can't be the left. It can't be AOC. It can't be Kamala Harris. So an election that's giving you that choice isn't the marker for the Sunday law. If you want it to be a choice that's being made, that choice is at the Exeter waymark. The Sunday law is both the culmination, it's the close of a specific test, but it's also the time when a testing message arrives and it's going to develop up until you get to the point of Exeter. We have that choice. And so there's that and all the other things that we discussed. And so I'll close there. Final questions before I pray. Okay, let's close with a word of prayer. Dear God, thank you for the opportunity that you've given us to study together. I know myself that I went through things pretty quickly and didn't give the opportunity to flesh them out individually. I pray that we could do that another time. I pray that you may be with us through each of our own personal studies as we try to understand more where we are in this earth's history. Please bless us as we continue through the Sabbath and receive the blessings of the Sabbath. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Curtis.